I'm Lucy Collins, 27 years old, and I built a life on responsibility, the kind where you quietly take care of things no one else wants to handle. For years, I made sure my grandmother was supported: groceries, appointments, bills, even small comforts my own parents wouldn't notice. But on Christmas Eve, when I found her shivering outside at nearly 30 below while my family laughed by the fire inside, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been taken for granted by people you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments, because you're not alone. Before I dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being dismissed or betrayed, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about drawing boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up in a house where warmth was measured in appearances, not affection. My parents hosted elaborate dinner parties with linen tablecloths and crystal glasses, but behind closed doors, conversations felt transactional. My father worked late most nights, returning home with the scent of cigars and disappointment clinging to his expensive suits. My mother managed social calendars like military campaigns, ensuring our family looked successful from the outside while something essential withered within our walls. The exception was Grandma. She lived 20 minutes away in a small apartment above Mrs. Chen's bakery, where the smell of fresh bread drifted through her windows each morning. While my parents spoke in measured tones about achievement and reputation, Grandma talked about silly things that mattered more than I realized then. She asked about my dreams, not my grades. She noticed when I was sad before I admitted it to myself. Every Tuesday after school, I took the bus to her place. She'd have cookies cooling on wire racks and stories ready about her childhood during the Depression. Not sob stories designed to teach lessons, but real memories filled with details that made me understand she had once been young and uncertain too. Her hands moved constantly while she talked, kneading dough or mending clothes, creating something useful while sharing pieces of herself. When I turned 16 and got my license, those Tuesday visits became my responsibility instead of hers. I drove her to doctor appointments, helped carry groceries up the narrow stairs to her apartment, and learned that she had been quietly managing small crises for years without mentioning them to anyone. The faucet in her bathroom had been dripping for months because she didn't want to bother the landlord. Her prescription costs had doubled, but she was skipping doses to make the bottles last longer. I started handling these problems without asking permission from my parents. When Grandma's ancient television finally died, I used money from my summer job to buy her a replacement. When her winter coat developed holes in both elbows, we went shopping together, and I convinced her to pick something warmer than the thin jacket she had been considering. These weren't grand gestures, just practical solutions to immediate needs, but they created a partnership between us that felt more genuine than any relationship I had with my immediate family. My parents noticed my involvement with Grandma, but their responses revealed how they viewed her place in our hierarchy. My mother would ask if I was spending too much time over there, as if caring for an elderly relative was a phase I would outgrow. My father worried about the cost of her medications, not because he couldn't afford to help, but because he seemed genuinely surprised that anyone expected him to contribute. They spoke about her the way people discuss household maintenance, something necessary but not particularly interesting. During family gatherings, this dynamic became more obvious. Grandma would arrive early to help with preparations, spending hours in the kitchen while my mother directed her movements with increasing impatience. She folded napkins, arranged appetizers, and listened to complaints about work or neighbors without offering unsolicited advice. But when guests arrived, she was directed to a corner chair where she could observe without interfering in adult conversations. I watched this happen dozens of times over the years. Grandma would sit quietly with her hands folded, occasionally approached by someone's child who wanted to show her a toy or ask for a story. She never looked resentful or hurt, just resigned to a role that had been assigned rather than chosen. The rest of us moved around her like she was furniture, functional but forgettable. My siblings accepted this arrangement without question. Sarah, 3 years older than me, was already planning her wedding and treated family events like networking opportunities, focusing on impressive relatives who might enhance her social prospects. Mark, 2 years younger, spent most gatherings in the basement playing video games, emerging only when summoned for photographs or meal service. Neither of them seemed to notice how Grandma was being systematically marginalized, or if they did notice, they didn't consider it worth addressing. The holidays amplified everything wrong with our family dynamics. Christmas preparations became elaborate productions where Grandma's contributions were essential but invisible. She spent days baking cookies that would be served on my mother's expensive platters without acknowledgement. She wrapped gifts that would be credited to whoever purchased them, not to the person who had carefully folded paper and tied ribbons. She cleaned dishes while conversations about vacation plans and business investments continued around her. I found myself becoming protective in ways that surprised me. When relatives made jokes about Grandma's hearing or memory, I would steer conversations elsewhere. When younger cousins ignored her attempts to engage with them, I would sit beside her and ask about her week, making space for her voice in rooms where she was increasingly treated as background noise. These small interventions felt inadequate, but I didn't know how to challenge a system that everyone else seemed to accept. The most painful moments were the casual cruelties, comments that revealed how my family truly perceived her worth. She gets confused easily now, my mother would explain when Grandma asked questions about plans that had been discussed without including her. She moves so slowly, my father would mutter when she needed assistance with stairs or heavy doors. These weren't observations about age-related changes that deserved compassion, but complaints about inconveniences that complicated their schedules. By the time I graduated high school, I understood that I was witnessing something that would only get worse. Grandma was becoming more dependent on others for transportation, medication management, and basic household tasks. But the people she had spent decades supporting were increasingly viewing her needs as burdens rather than opportunities to reciprocate her lifetime of service. The balance that had sustained our family for so long was shifting, and I was the only one who seemed concerned about what would happen when it collapsed completely. Looking back, I realized that those years of watching Grandma be slowly erased from her own family taught me everything I needed to know about the difference between love and obligation. Love shows up consistently, even when it's inconvenient. Love notices when someone is struggling and responds without being asked. Love protects dignity and creates space for every person to feel valued. What my family offered Grandma wasn't love, despite their claims about tradition and loyalty. It was tolerance, conditional and fragile, extended only as long as she didn't require too much effort or attention in return. I kept visiting her apartment every Tuesday, but now these conversations carried different weight. She was telling me stories about a world that was disappearing, about people who had understood that caring for family members wasn't a favor, but a fundamental responsibility. I was learning lessons about character that couldn't be taught in classrooms or absorbed from books. Most importantly, I was discovering who I wanted to become when tested by circumstances that revealed true priorities. The woman sitting across from me, sharing cookies and memories, was showing me how to love without conditions, even when that love wasn't fully returned. As the seasons changed and another Christmas approached, I had no idea that everything I had observed and learned would soon be put to the ultimate test. The fragile balance that had allowed my family to maintain their illusions while neglecting their responsibilities was about to shatter completely, and I would be forced to choose sides in a conflict that had been building for years. The foundation was already cracked. It just needed the right moment to collapse. The shift started slowly, small comments that accumulated like snowfall until their weight became impossible to ignore. During Sunday dinners at my parents' house, conversations about Grandma took on a different tone. Where once her occasional forgetfulness had been mentioned with mild concern, now these lapses were discussed as evidence of declining competence. My mother would recount stories about Grandma misplacing her purse or asking the same question twice, presenting these incidents as proof that she could no longer be trusted with basic decisions. "She's getting confused more often," my mother would say while clearing plates from our dining room table. "Yesterday she called me 3 times asking about the same doctor's appointment." I had to explain the schedule each time like she'd never heard it before. My father would nod from his position at the head of the table, already reaching for his evening newspaper. "It's natural at her age, but we need to be realistic about what she can handle." These conversations always happened in Grandma's absence, during family meals where her chair remained empty because she hadn't been invited. The discussions weren't motivated by genuine concern for her well-being, but by frustration with the additional effort her needs required. When I suggested including her in our Sunday dinners, my mother's response revealed the underlying calculation. She has trouble following conversations now, she explained. It's easier for everyone if she stays comfortable at home. But I knew Grandma wasn't staying home because she was comfortable there. She was staying home because my family had decided her presence was inconvenient. They were rewriting the narrative of her capabilities to justify their decreasing willingness to accommodate her needs. The woman who had organized countless family celebrations and managed her own household for 8 decades was suddenly being portrayed as incompetent because she asked for clarification about confusing medical instructions. My siblings embraced this new perspective with disturbing enthusiasm. Sarah, now engaged and planning an elaborate wedding, complained about having to repeat information during phone calls with Grandma. She doesn't remember what I told her about the venue, she said during one of our Sunday gatherings. I have to explain everything multiple times. It's exhausting. Mark, home from college for winter break, had developed a habit of speaking about Grandma as if she wasn't present during the rare occasions when she was included in family activities. She doesn't really understand what's happening anyway, he would say when someone suggested explaining plans or asking for her opinion. Why make it more complicated than it needs to be? I found myself becoming the sole defender of her dignity, a position that put me in conflict with everyone else in my family. When they made jokes about her hearing, I pointed out that they were speaking quietly and facing away from her. When they complained about her slow walking, I mentioned that she was managing arthritis without complaining. When they suggested she was becoming antisocial, I reminded them that she hadn't been invited to the last 4 family gatherings. My advocacy was met with increasing resistance. You're being overly sensitive, my mother told me after I objected to a particularly cruel comment about Grandma's appearance. We all love her, but that doesn't mean we have to pretend she isn't changing. But the changes weren't happening to Grandma as much as they were happening around her. Her memory remained sharp for important details, but she was being excluded from conversations that would help her stay informed about family news. Her mobility was declining, but no one offered assistance with transportation to events they expected her to attend. Her social isolation was increasing, but the isolation was being imposed by people who then criticized her for becoming withdrawn. The most insidious part of this dynamic was how quickly everyone adjusted to treating her as less than fully present. During holiday preparations, she was assigned tasks that kept her busy, but isolated from decision-making. She could polish silver in the kitchen while conversations about guest lists and menu planning happened in other rooms. She could wrap gifts in the basement while discussions about vacation plans and family finances took place upstairs. When relatives visited for holidays, they were unconsciously guided away from meaningful interaction with her. Don't tire her out with too many questions, my mother would suggest to cousins or family friends. She gets overwhelmed easily now. These warnings weren't based on Grandma's actual preferences or limitations, but on my family's desire to manage her involvement in ways that minimized their own discomfort. I started spending more time at her apartment, partly to escape the toxic atmosphere of family gatherings, but mostly because I wanted to understand her perspective on what was happening. She never directly complained about being excluded or dismissed, but her observations revealed that she was more aware of the situation than my family assumed. Your mother seems very busy lately, she would say when I mentioned that holiday plans were being made without consulting her. I don't want to add to her stress. Sarah has so much on her mind with the wedding, she would comment when my sister failed to return phone calls for days. Young people have their own lives to worry about. These gentle explanations for other people's behavior broke my heart because they demonstrated both her generosity and her acceptance of treatment she didn't deserve. She was making excuses for family members who were making excuses to avoid her. The woman who had spent decades creating space for everyone else's needs was now apologizing for having needs of her own. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner, when my father made a comment that revealed how completely they had redefined her role in our family. Grandma had prepared her traditional stuffing recipe, spending hours chopping vegetables and mixing ingredients in her small kitchen before I picked her up for dinner. But when guests complimented the stuffing during our meal, my father took credit for the recipe. "It's been in our family for generations," he said, ignoring Grandma's presence at the table. "My mother-in-law used to make it, but now we handle the cooking ourselves." The casual erasure was breathtaking. Grandma had not only prepared the dish everyone was praising, but she had taught my mother the recipe years earlier. She was sitting 3 feet away when my father claimed ownership of her work and dismissed her contribution as something from the past rather than the present. I waited for someone else to correct him. I waited for my mother to acknowledge Grandma's efforts. I waited for Sarah or Mark to point out the obvious mistake. But everyone continued eating and nodding, accepting a version of reality that excluded the person who had made their meal possible. That night, after driving Grandma back to her apartment, I sat in my car and understood that the situation had moved beyond casual neglect into deliberate cruelty. My family wasn't just taking her for granted anymore. They were actively rewriting history to justify their treatment of her. The foundation of respect and gratitude that should have supported her final years was crumbling, and I was watching it happen in real time. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes the air feel sharp in your lungs. The temperature had been dropping all week, and by evening the weather reports were warning about dangerous conditions for anyone exposed to the elements for more than a few minutes. I was running late, caught in holiday traffic, and delayed by last-minute gift purchases that had taken longer than expected. When I finally pulled into my parents' circular driveway, I could see warm lights spilling from the windows and shadows moving inside what I knew would be a perfect holiday scene. My mother had spent days preparing for this gathering, polishing silver and arranging flowers, ensuring that every detail would create the right impression for the extended family members and family friends who had been invited to share our Christmas Eve celebration. But as I walked toward the front door, something caught my attention on the porch. A figure was huddled against the wall beside the entrance, barely visible in the shadows cast by the decorative holiday lighting. It took me several seconds to process what I was seeing, and when I did, my heart stopped. Grandma was sitting on the concrete steps, wearing only a thin cardigan over her dress. No coat, no blanket, no protection against air cold enough to cause frostbite within minutes. She was shivering so violently that her entire body seemed to vibrate, and when she looked up at me, her lips had taken on a bluish tint that terrified me more than anything I had ever seen. "Grandma, what are you doing out here?" I dropped my packages and knelt beside her, immediately pulling off my coat to wrap around her shoulders. Her skin felt like ice, and when I took her hands in mine, they were so cold they seemed disconnected from her body. "The door," she whispered through chattering teeth. "I've been knocking, but no one hears me." I looked at the front door, solid oak with decorative glass panels that revealed the scene inside. Through the frosted glass, I could see my family gathered around the fireplace in our living room. The Christmas tree sparkled with lights and ornaments, presents were arranged in perfect piles underneath, and everyone was holding champagne glasses while they laughed at something my father was saying. They were 20 feet away from where Grandma had been freezing on the porch, and the sound of their conversation and laughter was loud enough that I could hear it clearly even through the closed door. They weren't inside because they hadn't heard her knocking. They were inside because they had chosen not to answer. "How long have you been out here?" I asked while lifting her to her feet, supporting her weight as we moved toward the door. "I don't know," she said. "A while. I thought maybe they didn't hear me at first, so I kept trying. Then I thought maybe I had the wrong time, so I waited to see if someone would come out." The wrong time. She had been sitting in life-threatening cold, making excuses for people who had left her on the porch deliberately. The woman who had never missed a family gathering, who had spent days preparing cookies and gifts for this celebration, had been abandoned outside like an unwanted package while everyone else enjoyed the warmth she had been denied. I opened the front door and carried her inside, my anger building with each step. The living room fell silent as we entered, conversations stopping mid-sentence as my family turned to stare at us. Grandma was still shivering against my chest, her lips blue and her breath coming in short gasps that created small clouds in the warm air. "How long have you all been sitting here while she froze outside?" The question came out of my mouth before I had time to consider the consequences. It hung in the air like smoke, impossible to take back and impossible to ignore. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the soft whimpering of Grandma's breathing as her body slowly began to warm. My mother was the first to recover, setting down her champagne glass with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain composure. "We didn't know she was out there," she said. "We would have heard her knocking." But even as she spoke, we all knew it wasn't true. The sound of Grandma's knocking would have been audible over their conversation, and even if they had somehow missed it, they would have seen her figure through the glass panels of the door if they had been paying any attention to anything beyond their own comfort. My father cleared his throat, a sound I recognized as his signal that he was preparing to take control of a situation that was becoming uncomfortable. "She must have just arrived," he said. "You know how she gets confused about timing these days." "She's been out there long enough to develop hypothermia," I said, feeling Grandma's body still trembling against mine. "Look at her. Look at what you've done." The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah set down her own glass and moved as if to approach us, then stopped halfway across the room when she saw the expression on my face. Mark remained frozen by the mantelpiece, his mouth slightly open as he processed what was happening. Extended relatives and family friends who had been enjoying the party atmosphere were now witnessing something that none of them knew how to address. The perfect holiday gathering my mother had orchestrated was collapsing into ugly truth, and there was no way to restore the illusion of family harmony once it had been shattered. "Let's get her into the kitchen," my mother said, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "We can make her some hot chocolate and help her warm up." But I could see the calculation in her eyes, the immediate shift toward damage control rather than genuine concern. She wasn't worried about Grandma's well-being. She was worried about how this scene would be remembered by the people whose opinions mattered to her social standing. I carried Grandma to the kitchen and helped her into a chair beside the radiator, wrapping additional blankets around her shoulders while I waited for feeling to return to her extremities. The rest of my family followed at a distance, uncertain about their roles in this drama that had erupted without warning. As Grandma's shivering began to subside and color returned to her face, the full weight of what had happened settled over me like a heavy coat. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was the inevitable result of months of systematic devaluation, the logical conclusion of treating another human being as dispensable. They had left her outside to freeze because they could. Because they had convinced themselves that her comfort and safety were less important than their own convenience. Because they had redefined love as something that could be rationed based on usefulness, rather than shared freely based on connection. The party continued in the living room, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were quieter, more careful, as if everyone was afraid of triggering another crisis. I stayed with Grandma in the kitchen, monitoring her breathing and warming her hands between mine, while the sound of forced laughter drifted in from the other room. By the time she felt strong enough to speak normally, I had made a decision that would change everything between me and my family. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. They had shown me who they really were when they thought no one was watching, and I would never be able to forget what I had seen. After settling Grandma safely in the kitchen with warm blankets and hot tea, I walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat with the engine running. The heater gradually filled the small space with warmth, but I couldn't stop shaking. Not from cold, but from the rage that was building in my chest like pressure behind a dam. Everything I had witnessed over the past few years, every small cruelty I had rationalized or excused, had led to this moment when my family had literally left an elderly woman to freeze rather than interrupt their holiday celebration. I thought about all the times I had defended them when Grandma made gentle comments about feeling forgotten. All the times I had convinced myself that their neglect was thoughtless rather than deliberate. All the times I had participated in their rewriting of her story, accepting their version of events because it was easier than confronting the truth about who they really were. The truth was that they had been testing boundaries for months, seeing how much they could take away from her before anyone objected. They had gradually reduced her role in family gatherings from participant to observer to burden. They had systematically excluded her from conversations, decisions, and plans until she became invisible to them. Tonight was simply the logical endpoint of a process that had been building toward this moment of absolute callousness. I drove home and spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene on the porch and imagining different outcomes. What if I had been even later? What if no one had come looking for her at all? What if she had given up knocking and tried to walk home in that cold, wearing only a cardigan? The possibilities were too terrible to contemplate, but they were real possibilities that had been narrowly avoided by accident rather than prevented by planning. The next morning, I called my Aunt Helen, my father's older sister who lived across the country but maintained contact with various family members throughout the year. I had always liked Helen because she asked direct questions and expected honest answers, traits that had made her less popular with my parents, but more trusted by me. "I need to tell you what happened last night," I said after we exchanged basic holiday greetings. Then I described the scene on the porch, the temperature, the length of time Grandma had been outside, and the reaction of my family when confronted with what they had done. Helen listened without interrupting, asking only a few questions to clarify details. When I finished, there was a long silence before she spoke. "I've been worried about something like this," she said. "Your grandmother mentioned feeling left out of things when we talked last month, but I thought maybe she was just feeling sorry for herself. I didn't realize it was this serious." That phone call led to others. Helen contacted cousins and family friends, sharing the story without editorial comment, but with enough detail that people could draw their own conclusions. I called Grandma's neighbors, people who had become friends with her over the years and who might need to know that she wasn't receiving adequate support from family members. Within days, the story had spread through our extended network in the way that shocking news always does. People called my parents directly, some offering help with Grandma's care, others asking pointed questions about what had actually happened on Christmas Eve. The carefully maintained image of family solidarity that my parents had cultivated for decades began to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. My mother's first response was predictable. She called me 3 days after Christmas, her voice tight with the kind of controlled anger she reserved for situations that threatened her social standing. "People are calling us asking about your grandmother," she said. "Apparently you've been telling stories about Christmas Eve that make us sound like monsters. I think you need to clarify what actually happened." "I've been telling people exactly what happened," I replied. "If that makes you sound like monsters, maybe you should think about why." "You know that's not fair," she continued. "We didn't know she was outside. If we had known, we would have brought her in immediately. You're making it sound deliberate." But the more she tried to explain their actions, the weaker her explanations became. They hadn't heard her knocking, despite being 20 feet away from the door. They hadn't seen her through the glass panels, despite the holiday lighting that illuminated the porch. They hadn't thought to check on her arrival, despite her being 90 minutes late for a gathering she had never missed in her entire life. My father took a different approach when he called the following week. Rather than denying what had happened, he focused on minimizing its significance and questioning my motives for sharing the story with others. "Family business should stay within the family," he said. "What happened was unfortunate, but it doesn't represent who we are or how we feel about your grandmother. By talking to outsiders about it, you're hurting all of us for no good reason." "I'm not hurting you," I told him. "I'm telling the truth about something that actually happened. If the truth hurts your reputation, that's a consequence of your choices, not mine." The calls from extended family members revealed how isolated my parents had become in their treatment of Grandma. Cousins shared stories about similar incidents they had witnessed, but hadn't addressed directly. Neighbors mentioned concerns they had been afraid to voice. Family friends described conversations with Grandma where she had made comments about feeling forgotten, but had asked them not to say anything because she didn't want to cause trouble. The pattern was clear to everyone except my immediate family. They had been systematically excluding and devaluing Grandma while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives. They had relied on her generosity and discretion to protect them from criticism, confident that she would never complain publicly about their treatment. But now that the story was public, their behavior was being evaluated by people who hadn't been gradually conditioned to accept it as normal. The shock and dismay expressed by extended family members forced them to confront how far they had strayed from basic standards of decency and respect. Sarah called me after receiving what she described as uncomfortable questions from wedding guests who had heard about the Christmas Eve incident. "People are asking me if it's true that we left Grandma outside in the cold," she said. "I don't know what to tell them. It sounds so much worse when strangers hear about it than it felt when it was happening." That was the closest any of my family members came to acknowledging that their actions had been wrong. Not because they suddenly developed empathy for Grandma's experience, but because they were being judged by people whose opinions mattered to them. The social consequences escalated quickly. Holiday invitations for the following year became scarce. Business associates and neighbors began treating my parents with polite distance. Church members who had once sought their involvement in committees and charitable activities stopped asking for their participation. The isolation they had imposed on Grandma was now being imposed on them, and they discovered that being excluded from social circles was painful in ways they had never considered when they were the ones doing the excluding. For the first time in their lives, they were experiencing the consequences of treating another person as disposable. I found myself strangely calm during this period. After years of watching Grandma be marginalized and dismissed, there was something deeply satisfying about seeing my family face judgment for their actions. I wasn't actively working to damage their reputation, but I wasn't protecting it either. When people asked me questions, I answered honestly. When they expressed shock or dismay, I didn't minimize what had happened to spare my family embarrassment. The silence I had maintained for years, the excuses I had made, the rationalizations I had accepted, they all disappeared on that Christmas Eve when I found Grandma shivering on the porch. The contract that had bound me to protect my family's image had been broken the moment they demonstrated that their comfort mattered more to them than her survival. The months following Christmas brought a kind of reckoning I hadn't anticipated. As word of what had happened spread through our community, people began sharing their own observations about my family's treatment of Grandma. Stories emerged that painted a picture of systematic neglect that had been building for years while I was focused on smaller, more obvious incidents. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store mentioned that she had seen Grandma walking home with heavy bags during winter weather, struggling with items that should have been delivered or carried by family members. The pharmacist at her usual drugstore said she had been asking about generic alternatives to medications she couldn't afford, trying to stretch prescriptions by taking half doses without telling anyone. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chin from the bakery downstairs, revealed that Grandma had been skipping meals regularly, not because she wasn't hungry, but because she was saving money for holiday gifts she felt obligated to buy for family members who rarely acknowledged her efforts. The woman who had fed us countless meals was rationing food for herself while ensuring everyone else received presents they would forget about within weeks. These discoveries hit me harder than the Christmas Eve incident because they revealed ongoing suffering I had missed while focusing on more dramatic moments of exclusion. Grandma had been quietly managing multiple forms of hardship, protecting my family's reputation by handling problems alone rather than asking for help that might make them look bad to outsiders. I started spending more time at her apartment, not just for Tuesday visits, but throughout the week, checking on her needs and gradually taking over responsibilities that should have been shared among multiple family members. I arranged grocery delivery services, organized her medications in weekly containers, and made sure her heating bills were current as winter deepened into the coldest months. During these visits, I began to understand the full extent of her isolation. Phone calls from my parents had become infrequent duty calls, focused on her health rather than her happiness. Visits from Sarah and Mark had stopped entirely after Christmas, as if the embarrassment of being exposed as neglectful had made them decide that avoiding her was easier than changing their behavior. "They're busy with their own lives," Grandma would say when I asked about the lack of contact. "Young people have important things to worry about." But she was making these excuses with less conviction than before, as if even her generous interpretation of their actions was becoming harder to maintain. The woman who had spent decades creating space for everyone else's needs was finally beginning to recognize that her own needs deserved consideration too. The turning point came in early March when Grandma had what her doctor called a minor cardiac episode that landed her in the hospital for 3 days. I was the only family member who visited during her stay, the only one who spoke with doctors about her care, and the only one who helped her transition back to independent living when she was discharged. My parents sent flowers and a card expressing concern, but they didn't visit or call to check on her recovery. Sarah sent a text message asking for updates, but didn't offer to help with any aspect of her care. Mark was apparently unaware that she had been hospitalized at all until I mentioned it during a phone call a week later. Their absence during this crisis made it clear that I had become Grandma's sole reliable support system by default rather than by choice. While I was grateful to be able to help her, the burden of being her only advocate was becoming overwhelming, especially as her needs increased with age and declining health. More importantly, their continued neglect was causing psychological harm that medical treatment couldn't address. Grandma was beginning to internalize their message that she was a burden, apologizing for needing assistance and expressing guilt about taking up my time with her problems. "I don't want to be trouble," she said repeatedly during her recovery period. "Maybe I should look into one of those senior communities where I wouldn't need to depend on family so much." The idea of her moving to institutional care because my family couldn't be bothered to share responsibility for her well-being filled me with a fury that surprised me with its intensity. She didn't need institutional care, she needed family members who would treat her with basic respect and consideration. The woman who had created a foundation of love and stability for all of us deserved better than being warehoused because her needs had become inconvenient. I made a decision that spring that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Instead of continuing to manage Grandma's care alone while my family maintained comfortable distance, I decided to force them into direct confrontation with the consequences of their choices. I called a family meeting for a Sunday in April, telling everyone that we needed to discuss Grandma's future care needs. I didn't explain the specific agenda, but I made it clear that attendance was mandatory and that decisions would be made whether they participated or not. The meeting took place in my parents' living room, the same space where they had been laughing by the fireplace while Grandma froze on the porch months earlier. Everyone attended, though Sarah complained about having to rearrange wedding plans and Mark seemed annoyed about missing some social event he considered more important. I had prepared for this conversation by documenting everything I had been handling alone since Christmas. Doctor appointments, prescription management, grocery shopping, household repairs, financial assistance, transportation needs, and social interaction. The list was extensive and detailed, making it clear that Grandma's care required significant time and attention from people who actually cared about her well-being. "This is what I've been doing for the past 4 months," I said, passing copies of my documentation to each family member. "These are the responsibilities that need to be shared if we're going to keep Grandma living independently, which is what she wants and what she deserves." My parents reviewed the list with expressions that shifted from surprise to discomfort to something approaching panic. They had assumed that I would continue managing everything alone, that their symbolic gestures of concern would be sufficient to maintain the appearance of family involvement while avoiding actual responsibility. "We didn't realize you were handling all of this," my mother said, though her tone suggested she was more concerned about being caught in ignorance than grateful for my efforts. "We would have helped if you had asked." But that response revealed exactly the problem I was trying to address. They thought helping Grandma was my responsibility by default, something they might assist with if specifically requested, rather than a shared obligation that required their proactive involvement. "I'm not asking you to help me," I said. "I'm telling you that starting next month, these responsibilities will be divided equally among all of us, or Grandma will move in with me and you'll lose access to her entirely." The ultimatum I delivered that April afternoon changed everything, though not in ways anyone expected. My parents' first response was predictable anger about being forced to confront responsibilities they had been avoiding for months. They accused me of being dramatic, of making unreasonable demands, of trying to control family decisions that should be made collectively. But when I laid out the specific tasks that needed to be managed, the medical appointments that required coordination, and the daily support that was necessary for Grandma to maintain her independence, their protests became increasingly hollow. They couldn't argue with the practical reality of what caring for an elderly person actually required, and they couldn't deny that I had been handling these responsibilities alone while they focused on their own priorities. Sarah's response revealed how little she understood about Grandma's situation despite months of public embarrassment about their treatment of her. "Can't we just hire someone to help her?" she asked, as if paying a stranger to provide care was equivalent to family involvement. "She doesn't need professional care," I explained. "She needs family members who show up consistently, who remember her preferences, who treat her like a person rather than a problem to be solved. You can't hire someone to love her." Mark's contribution was even more telling. "I don't really have time for regular visits," he said. "Between work and everything else, I can maybe do one weekend a month, but that's probably it." One weekend a month. For the woman who had attended every birthday party, every graduation, every important moment in his life, who had helped pay for his college textbooks when money was tight, who had listened to his problems and celebrated his achievements with genuine enthusiasm for over 20 years. My father took a more calculating approach, asking about the financial implications of increased involvement and whether Grandma's insurance would cover additional services. He seemed more concerned about potential costs than about her emotional needs or quality of life. "What exactly are we talking about in terms of time commitment?" he asked, as if caring for his wife's mother was a business proposition that needed to be evaluated for return on investment. I realized during that conversation that they still didn't understand what had happened on Christmas Eve. Not really. They thought the problem was logistics, that better planning and coordination would prevent future embarrassment while allowing them to maintain minimal involvement in Grandma's daily life. But the problem wasn't logistical, it was fundamental. They had stopped seeing her as a full person deserving of love and attention. They had reduced her to a collection of needs that interfered with their convenience, and no amount of scheduling or task division would restore the respect and affection that should have motivated their care. I gave them 2 weeks to decide how they wanted to proceed. Either they would commit to sharing responsibility for Grandma's well-being, with specific assignments and accountability measures, or I would help her move into the spare bedroom in my apartment and they would lose regular access to her. The deadline forced them to confront a choice they had been avoiding for months. They could continue treating her as disposable and face the consequences of being excluded from her life, or they could acknowledge that caring for family members requires actual effort and emotional investment. Their response came in the form of a series of individual phone calls rather than a collective decision, which told me everything I needed to know about their commitment to collaborative problem-solving. My mother called first, her voice carrying the careful tone she used when trying to manage difficult situations without accepting responsibility for creating them. "We've been talking," she said, "and we think the best solution would be for you to continue managing most of Grandma's care, since you're already established in that role and she's comfortable with the arrangement. We can contribute financially to cover any additional costs, and we'll make more effort to visit regularly." More effort to visit regularly. The same promise they had been making and breaking for years, now offered as if it represented meaningful change rather than continued avoidance of actual responsibility. "That's not what I proposed," I told her. "I offered equal sharing of responsibilities, not financial contributions while I continue doing all the work." Sarah's call came 2 days later, focused primarily on how increased involvement with Grandma would impact her wedding plans and early marriage. She had calculated that regular visits and care responsibilities would interfere with social obligations she considered more important. "Maybe we could revisit this after the honeymoon," she suggested. "Once things settle down and I have a better sense of my schedule as a married person." After the honeymoon. After the wedding stress ended and married life began and career priorities were established and children arrived and mortgage payments started and retirement planning became necessary, there would always be something more immediate and personally relevant than caring for an elderly relative whose needs were increasing with age. Mark didn't call at all. I heard through my parents that he had decided to step back from family drama until everyone could figure out a more reasonable approach to the situation. The prospect of being held accountable for consistent involvement in Grandma's care was apparently too overwhelming for him to engage with directly. My father's response was the most honest, even though it was also the most disappointing. When he called at the end of the 2-week period, he didn't make promises about increased involvement or offer financial solutions to complex emotional needs. "Your grandmother has had a good life," he said. "She's in her 80s, she's been independent for years, and now she needs more help than she used to." That's natural. But expecting us to rearrange our lives around her care isn't realistic, especially when there are professional services available that could meet her practical needs more efficiently than family members can. Professional services. Efficient solutions. Natural progression. He was talking about the woman who had raised his wife, who had been present for every important moment in our family's history, as if she was a project that needed to be managed rather than a person who deserved love. That conversation clarified everything I needed to know about their priorities and values. They weren't willing to change their behavior, accept responsibility for their neglect, or commit to treating Grandma with the respect she had earned through decades of service to our family. I called Grandma that evening and asked if she would like to move in with me while we looked for a more suitable apartment together, somewhere closer to medical facilities and social activities, but far enough from my family's influence that she could rebuild relationships based on genuine affection rather than obligation. Her response surprised me with its immediate relief. "I would like that very much," she said. "I've been lonely in this apartment, and I've been worried about what would happen if I had another health scare with no one nearby to help." She had been planning for the possibility of emergencies, while my family had been planning to avoid responsibility for preventing them. The woman they had abandoned was still thinking about practical solutions and considering other people's needs, while the people who should have been supporting her were focused entirely on protecting their own comfort. We spent the following weekend looking at apartments in my neighborhood, places with better lighting and accessible bathrooms and proximity to the grocery store and pharmacy she used regularly. By the end of the month, we had found a perfect 2-bedroom unit in a building with other active seniors and a management company that organized social activities. My family's reaction to news of her move was predictably focused on how it would affect them rather than how it would benefit her. They worried about losing face with relatives and neighbors who would wonder why Grandma had left her longtime home to live near me instead of them. They complained about the inconvenience of traveling farther for visits they had been avoiding anyway. But their concerns were no longer my problem to solve. I had given them multiple opportunities to participate in caring for someone who had cared for all of us, and they had chosen convenience over compassion, image over action, excuses over accountability. The move took place on a sunny Saturday in June. Several of Grandma's neighbors came to say goodbye and help carry boxes, people who had developed genuine friendships with her over the years and who understood her value in ways my family apparently did not. Mrs. Chin from the bakery gave her a tin of cookies for her new home. The pharmacist stopped by with a card signed by his entire staff. The mail carrier, who had been delivering to her address for over a decade, took time from his weekend to wish her well in her new neighborhood. These gestures of affection from relative strangers highlighted how completely my family had failed to appreciate what they were losing. People who had known Grandma for a few years understood her worth better than relatives who had benefited from her love for decades. As we loaded the last boxes into my car, I looked back at the apartment building where she had lived independently for so long, where she had managed her own life with dignity while my family systematically reduced their involvement in it. She was leaving not because she couldn't take care of herself anymore, but because the people who should have been her safety net had proved themselves unreliable. The first few months of living near each other established routines that revealed how much energy Grandma had been spending on managing isolation and insecurity. With regular companionship and reliable support, her health improved noticeably. Her appetite increased, her mood brightened, and her engagement with daily activities returned to levels I hadn't seen in years. We developed patterns that worked for both of us. Morning coffee together twice a week, grocery shopping on Sundays, doctor appointments when needed with someone who actually listened to her concerns and asked relevant questions. She joined a senior center book club and started attending exercise classes designed for people with arthritis. Her social world expanded beyond family obligations into genuine friendships based on shared interests rather than duty. The contrast with her previous isolation was stark. She had been withering under the stress of feeling unwanted and burdensome, and now she was flourishing with consistent support and respect for her autonomy. The woman my family had described as declining and confused was actually sharp, funny, and remarkably resilient when given appropriate care and attention. Meanwhile, my family struggled with the consequences of their choices in ways they hadn't anticipated. Extended relatives who had been critical of their treatment of Grandma were now openly curious about why she had moved away from them to live near me. Questions at social gatherings became more pointed, assumptions about their character more negative. My mother's carefully maintained image as a devoted daughter-in-law crumbled under scrutiny from church friends and neighbors who wondered why she wasn't providing care for her husband's elderly mother. She found herself making excuses that sounded hollow even to her, explaining Grandma's relocation as a personal preference rather than acknowledging the neglect that had necessitated it. Sarah's wedding became a source of additional embarrassment when relatives asked about Grandma's absence from planning activities and pre-wedding celebrations. The woman who should have been honored as the family matriarch was notably missing from events where her presence had once been assumed, and people noticed. Mark discovered that his college friends and work colleagues, many of whom maintained close relationships with their own grandparents, found his casual dismissal of family responsibilities difficult to understand. Conversations about weekend plans and holiday visits highlighted his selfishness in ways that damaged his reputation among peers whose opinions he valued. My father faced questions from business associates who had known Grandma through years of company picnics and retirement parties. Her absence from family gatherings that these colleagues occasionally attended created awkward moments where he had to explain relationship dynamics that reflected poorly on his character. But the social consequences were only part of what they had lost. The more time I spent with Grandma in her new environment, the more I understood what an extraordinary person they had taken for granted and ultimately discarded. She possessed institutional memory about our family that went back generations, stories about relatives and traditions that would die with her if no one took the time to listen and remember. She had skills in cooking, gardening, and household management that represented accumulated wisdom from decades of practical experience. She had perspectives on relationships and problem-solving that came from navigating complex family dynamics for 80 years. Most importantly, she had unconditional love to offer, the kind of steady affection that doesn't fluctuate based on achievement or convenience. She celebrated small victories, provided comfort during setbacks, and maintained faith in people's potential for growth even when they disappointed her repeatedly. My family had given up access to all of this richness because they couldn't be bothered to drive across town for regular visits or help manage medical appointments. They had traded away irreplaceable relationship wealth for temporary convenience, and now they were discovering that the cost had been higher than they realized. The first attempt at reconciliation came 6 months after Grandma's move, when Sarah called to ask if she could visit for a weekend afternoon. Her tone was carefully casual, as if the months of absence had been a minor oversight rather than deliberate avoidance. "I've been meaning to see Grandma's new place," she said. "Maybe we could all have lunch together sometime soon." But I had learned to recognize the difference between genuine interest and image management. Sarah wasn't calling because she missed Grandma or felt guilty about abandoning her during the move. She was calling because her continued absence was creating problems for her socially, and she needed to be seen making an effort. "Grandma would love to see you," I told her. "But visits need to be about spending time with her, not about making yourself feel better about months of neglect. If you're ready to commit to regular contact and genuine relationship building, we can arrange something. If you're looking for a photo opportunity to prove you're a caring granddaughter, find someone else to help with your image rehabilitation." The directness of my response clearly surprised her. She had expected me to facilitate her re-entry into Grandma's life the way I had facilitated so many other family interactions over the years, smoothing over conflicts and managing difficult emotions so everyone could maintain comfortable illusions about their behavior. But I was no longer willing to protect my family from the consequences of their choices. They had demonstrated their priorities clearly through months of action and inaction. If they wanted different relationships with Grandma, they would need to earn them through consistent effort and genuine change, not through symbolic gestures designed to restore their reputations. My parents' approach was more subtle, but equally self-serving. They began sending cards and small gifts, calling occasionally to ask about Grandma's health, and mentioning her positively in conversations with extended relatives. They were creating evidence of involvement that could be referenced if questioned about their care for her. But these gestures rang hollow because they weren't accompanied by actual presence or meaningful support. They were checking boxes rather than building relationship, managing perception rather than addressing the fundamental disrespect that had driven Grandma away from them. When I mentioned their renewed contact to Grandma, her response revealed how clearly she understood the difference between authentic care and damage control. "They're being very thoughtful," she said diplomatically. "I appreciate that they're thinking of me." But there was no excitement in her voice, no eagerness to rebuild connections that had been severed by their neglect. She was responding politely to people who had hurt her deeply, offering courtesy where they had offered cruelty, but not investing emotional energy in relationships that had proved unreliable. The woman who had spent decades making excuses for their behavior and protecting their feelings was finally allowing herself to maintain appropriate distance from people who had demonstrated their inability to reciprocate her loyalty. It was a form of self-protection that was both overdue and entirely justified. As the first anniversary of that Christmas Eve approached, I reflected on how completely the family dynamics had shifted. Grandma was healthier and happier than she had been in years, living independently with appropriate support and engaging meaningfully with people who valued her company. I had learned to set boundaries that protected both of us from exploitation disguised as family obligation. My parents and siblings were dealing with reputational damage and social isolation that reflected their actual character rather than their carefully maintained image. They were experiencing the loneliness and dismissal they had imposed on someone who had loved them unconditionally, and discovering that these consequences were both deserved and difficult to escape. The balance that had sustained our family's dysfunction for so long had been permanently altered. The person who had absorbed everyone else's selfishness while receiving minimal consideration in return was no longer available to serve that function. The people who had taken her love for granted while offering obligation disguised as affection were learning that such arrangements eventually collapse under their own weight. 2 years have passed since that Christmas Eve, and the changes that began with my family's cruel indifference have settled into permanent new patterns. Grandma celebrated her 85th birthday last month with friends from her book club and neighbors from her apartment building, people who have come to know and love her during the time my family has been absent from her life. She is thriving in ways that continue to surprise both of us. The senior center where she takes her exercise classes asked her to help coordinate their monthly potluck dinners because other participants gravitated toward her natural warmth and organizational skills. The local library recruited her to read stories to children during their weekly program, and she has become a favorite among both kids and parents who appreciate her patient attention and genuine enthusiasm. Her health has stabilized at levels that her doctor describes as remarkable for someone her age. The anxiety and depression that had been building during those years of family neglect have largely resolved, replaced by a sense of purpose and community that provides the emotional foundation for physical well-being. Most importantly, she has stopped making excuses for other people's behavior toward her. When relatives call with shallow expressions of concern, she responds politely but doesn't invest energy in maintaining relationships that have proved one-sided. When my siblings make token efforts to reconnect, she accepts their gestures graciously without pretending they represent meaningful change. The woman who spent decades absorbing other people's selfishness while protecting their feelings has learned to protect her own emotional resources. She is still generous with her love and attention, but now she directs these gifts toward people who reciprocate them rather than those who exploit them. My relationship with my family has settled into careful distance, punctuated by necessary interactions for legal or medical issues that require group decisions. We speak when circumstances demand it, but the easy intimacy that once connected us has been permanently severed by their treatment of someone I loved and their refusal to acknowledge the damage they caused. They have made various attempts to restore normal family dynamics over the past 2 years, but these efforts consistently reveal their continued failure to understand what actually went wrong. They focus on surface reconciliation rather than fundamental character change, seeking to restore comfort and convenience without addressing the cruelty and selfishness that created the original problem. Sarah's marriage lasted 18 months before ending in divorce proceedings that surprised no one who had observed her capacity for sustained commitment to difficult responsibilities. Her wedding, which had been prioritized over Grandma's needs during that crucial period, became an expensive celebration of a relationship she wasn't mature enough to maintain. She has reached out several times requesting help with various crises related to her divorce, apparently forgetting that her availability for family members in need had been limited when Grandma required support. Her assumption that I would drop everything to provide assistance she had been unwilling to offer reveals how completely she misunderstood the lessons of the previous few years. Mark has continued his pattern of avoiding family responsibilities while expecting family benefits, missing important events, but assuming he will be included in holiday celebrations and inheritance discussions. His belief that family membership requires no ongoing investment of time or attention has been repeatedly challenged by relatives who have grown tired of accommodating his selfishness. My parents have aged noticeably during this period, and I suspect their isolation from extended family and community support is contributing to both physical and emotional decline. They are learning that reputation damaged by cruel behavior toward vulnerable people cannot be easily restored, and that social connections severed by selfishness are not automatically renewable when circumstances change. The irony is that they are now experiencing many of the challenges they inflicted on Grandma during her final years with our family. They are feeling excluded from gatherings they once dominated, dismissed by people whose opinions they value, and increasingly dependent on assistance from family members who have less patience with their needs than they deserve. But unlike Grandma, who bore their neglect with grace and dignity while making excuses for their behavior, they respond to social isolation with bitterness and blame. They cannot understand how their actions led to these consequences, and they are unwilling to accept responsibility for creating circumstances they now find painful. The difference in their responses to adversity reveals the fundamental character distinctions that led to this outcome. Grandma faced increasing vulnerability, with gratitude for available support and consideration for other people's needs. My parents are facing similar challenges with entitlement to assistance they haven't earned and resentment toward people who fail to provide it unconditionally. Last week, I received a call from my father asking if I would consider moving back to help manage my mother's health issues, which have become more complex recently. His tone carried the same expectation of automatic family obligation that had characterized their treatment of Grandma before she became inconvenient to them. "We're going to need more support as we get older," he said. "It would be much easier if you were living closer and could help coordinate appointments and handle emergencies when they come up." The request was remarkable for its complete lack of self-awareness. The man who had been unwilling to drive across town to check on his wife's elderly mother was now expecting me to rearrange my life to provide care for parents who had demonstrated their inability to reciprocate support when others needed it. "There are professional services available that could meet your practical needs more efficiently than family members can," I told him, using his own words from our conversation about Grandma's care 2 years earlier. The silence that followed my response lasted long enough for him to process both the rejection and the reminder of his own callousness when faced with similar circumstances. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried hurt and confusion that might have moved me if I hadn't watched him respond with indifference to Grandma's much greater vulnerability. "I thought family was supposed to take care of each other," he said. "So did I replied. "I learned otherwise from watching how this family takes care of its most vulnerable members." That conversation crystallized something I had been understanding gradually over the past 2 years. The people who had taught me that family love was conditional and family support was rationed based on convenience were now discovering that those lessons applied to them as well when their own needs increased. They had spent years modeling behavior that prioritized personal comfort over family loyalty, individual convenience over collective responsibility. Now that they were the ones requiring care and consideration, they were learning that the foundation of mutual support they had eroded could not be quickly rebuilt when circumstances made them dependent rather than independent. Grandma's legacy lives on in the choices I make about relationships and responsibility, but it has been shaped by witnessing both her generous example and my family's cruel treatment of her generosity. She taught me how to love without conditions, but they taught me that unconditional love offered to people who exploit it becomes a form of enabling rather than caring. I continue to visit Grandma twice a week, and she continues to enrich my life with her wisdom, humor, and steady affection. The relationship we built during her final years has become the foundation for my understanding of what family can be when it is based on genuine care rather than social obligation. She will not live forever, but the lessons I learned from both loving her and protecting her will outlast any individual relationship. The boundaries I established with my family during this period have become permanent features of my life, protecting me from people who mistake kindness for weakness and generosity for stupidity. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is refusing to let cruelty hide behind tradition or selfishness disguise itself as family loyalty. Sometimes, the most important lesson you can learn is when to stop making excuses for people who have demonstrated their inability to change. And sometimes, the truest form of family is the one you choose to build with people who understand that love requires action, not just words or shared history. The woman who sat freezing on that porch while her family laughed by the fireplace taught me all of these lessons through her example of grace under pressure and her quiet dignity in the face of undeserved treatment. The family who left her there taught me equally important lessons about recognizing selfishness, disguised as normalcy, and protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit their loyalty. Both sets of lessons were necessary for becoming the person I am today, someone who understands the difference between love and obligation, between family and relatives, between protecting people who deserve it and enabling people who don't. The cost of these lessons was watching someone I loved suffer unnecessarily, but the value has been learning how to prevent such suffering in relationships I can still influence and control. Grandma is napping in her sunny apartment as I write this, surrounded by pictures of people who have come to love her over the past 2 years rather than people who took her love for granted over the previous decades. She is safe, respected, and valued by a community that recognizes her worth rather than a family that had forgotten it. That is the resolution she deserved, and the one I was finally able to help her achieve when I stopped protecting people who had proved they didn't deserve protection. The balance that had been wrong for so long has been corrected, not through revenge or punishment, but through the simple act of prioritizing her well-being over their comfort. Some stories end with forgiveness and reconciliation. This one ends with boundaries and consequences, with love redirected toward people who reciprocate it and responsibilities shared with those who understand their weight. It is a quieter resolution than dramatic confrontation, but it has proved more lasting than any gesture of forgiveness that failed to address the fundamental character flaws that created the original problem. In the end, the truest victory was not changing my family, which proved impossible, but removing Grandma from their influence, which proved necessary. They are still who they always were, but she is no longer available to absorb the costs of their selfishness. That shift in availability changed everything else that mattered. And that night changed everything. I finally stopped excusing the people who left Grandma out in the cold, literally. What about you? Have you ever had to draw a hard line with family who didn't value someone you loved? Do you believe blood is enough to excuse that kind of behavior, or should actions speak louder? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to hear your perspective. And if this story resonated, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true stories about standing up, setting boundaries, and protecting what really matters.